Welcome to Hope Channel International. This video talks about how we don't turn away from God because of one big event, but little by little.
Well, help me understand that a little bit. These are God's people, and he turns them over. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's a pagan king. He's turning them over to Nebuchadnezzar. What's going on?
Well, I mean, Sean, there's a lot going on here. I don't know that we can talk about it all, but Israel, although they were God's people, had fallen into all kinds of idolatrous worship. They had gone into sacrificing their children. They had put false idols into God's temple. I mean, there was a whole level of just total going away from God, just a total rejection of God's word, God's law to them, and also his general character. They had rejected it all.
Well, let me push the pause button there for a second. We don't want to lose Daniel chapter 1, but as you're talking about the things that Israel was doing in Jeremiah 1, I was looking at this earlier today knowing we'd be studying this. It says in Jeremiah 1 verse 16, Israel has forsaken me, burned incense to other gods.
Yeah.
It says in Jeremiah 2 verse 5, they've gone far from me, have followed idols and become idolaters. Verse 11, they've changed their gods, to gods that are not gods. My people have committed two evils. They forsook me, the fountain of living waters. This list is horrific. If you go to Ezekiel, as you said a moment ago, they were putting their children in the arms of idols as sacrifices. Now, here's the question I've got for you. How do you get from God's chosen people, following Joshua into the promised land, seeing God move like that, establishing his promise, to this? How do you get there?
Well, Sean, I actually think in some ways, it's relatively easy and yet hard at the same time. And what I mean by that is there's an incremental process that happens. That, you know, we make one decision. You've been there before. You've committed to do a certain thing for God, and you say, well, I'll just let this one thing slip. And then I'll let it slip again. And then 30 days later, a month later, a year later, you're far from God. Maybe that thing was going to church. Maybe that particular promise to God was fidelity to your wife. Maybe that particular promise to God was quality time with your children. And yet just a little bit, well, I've got to have this meeting. You know, pastors fall into that. I'm a pastor.
Yeah,
I got to go to this meeting. I got to go to this, take care of this church agenda. And what happens is slowly but surely you have moved away from the will and the direction that God has desired in your life.
So often we wander away from God, not in giant leaps.
Correct.
But in little bitty steps.
Absolutely.
And so years go by. I mean, it's not like they followed Joshua into the promised land one week and they're sacrificing their children the next,
Correct.
although there's some pretty striking stories back there too.
Right.
Incrementally.
Correct.
Is it possible then that maybe sometimes the only thing that's wrong with a certain activity is that it encourages you to go to the next step? I mean, maybe it's something it's not particularly wrong in and of itself, but
Right.
because you let your guard down, you think, you know what, maybe that's not so bad.
Maybe it's not so bad. And not only that, Sean, but when you look at, when you go back to the Exodus story, you know, the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, you know, there's something else that at work here in addition to incrementalism. They had come out of Egypt and they started complaining because what they had in Egypt was different than what they experienced in the wilderness. And although they were under bondage, they felt that the pleasantries that were available in Egypt were worth the sacrifice of bondage rather than the difficulties that they found in freedom while going with God. So sometimes I think, Sean, there is a desire in our heart that desires maybe more the things of the world, even if they come with their own consequences. Often, Sean, we think that following God comes with consequences, and it does. But the consequences that come with following the world, I think, are more severe. I mean, they are, as we just mentioned there, Egypt was in bondage. They didn't have the choice. God gives us a choice, and sometimes it might get difficult, but nevertheless, he gives us the opportunity to follow him by our free choice and not by some edict or
right.
Yeah.
And there's probably a warning in there. I mean, as you mentioned Israel thinking, man, why aren't we back in Egypt? Is it possible that sometimes in following God, we forget just how much slavery there is in sin?